afternoon, everybody. I'm back. You might have been with me this morning with Greg Cosell talking day 2 and 3 wide receivers. Well, it's big wide receiver day, 6 days out from the NFL draft. That's Scott Barrett. I'm Joe Dolan. Good to be with everybody again. Everybody watching on demand, make sure you go to fantasypoints.com, read Scott's production models for running back, tight end. We're going to talk running backs and tight ends next week, but the wide receiver article, Scott, is your longest. It's the one that took the longest to put together, and it's freshest in our minds. So we're just going to backtrack to running backs and tight ends next week before the NFL draft. But it's good to be with you. This is, in my opinion, just an unbelievable resource for dynasty fantasy players. If you get the traditional scouting reports from Greg Cosell, you get Wes's kind of background with the dynasty slant, and then your model, the production model, is just what they did. They're brutally honest. I think you called it numbers. It's production. And it's 3 different angles to attack for Dynasty. And, you know, I guess I could say unfortunately, but I mean, that's just kind of what you're going to do when you have all different angles of attack. We do have different opinions on people. And I think it's a great thing to discuss. And we're going to get into your process. But first, how are you doing? What's going on?
I'm doing good. I just kind of want to lay out a few things from this piece. So it's 22% the length of The Catcher in the Rye by word count. This is massively long. I know it's going to rub some subscribers the wrong way, but this is just basically me showing my work. This is phase 1 of my model. Phase 2 is athleticism, aka Spork Score. That's on the site. That's looking only at each position, and each position by archetype, their most predictive events and how that correlates and ranks them by athleticism, by their score. And then phase 3 merges those two together. And I'll have my rankings up on the site either today or tomorrow in an article form. And then I'll update that again after the draft. Draft capital is another massively important predictive variable. But if you just want to, you're watching the draft and you see Tyquan Thornton goes to your favorite team, you can pull up the article, see what I thought about this player. Really just me showing you and the readers my work. If you don't want that, if you just want the names, you can read the article that has the rankings. And I'll say from a macro perspective, this was a really difficult class. I don't know that it's necessarily a bad class. It's just going to be, by the nature of who these players are, a very boom or bust class, because that's how the profile. It seems that the more my model likes a player, the more damning one of their red flags is, the more alarming or scary that red flag is. So I see this class as pretty similar to 2016. I think maybe it's a little bit better than 2016. But if you'll remember from that class, Corey Coleman was the first wide receiver off the board. Wide receiver 2, Will Fuller. Maybe that's Jameson Williams. Wide receiver 3, Josh Doxson. Wide receiver 4, Laquan Treadwell. Maybe that's Drake London. I don't think so, but some people are saying that. And then Michael Thomas, wide receiver 6, Tyreek Hill, wide receiver 16. So I see basically you take the top 8 wide receivers, and I think you're going to get 3 mega Pro Bowlers and 3 massive busts. And it's just who are those players going to be? Can we know pre hindsight? I don't know that we can. And I think NFL teams are viewing it the same way. We're just high risk, high reward prospects, but very risky, very dangerous. But I don't see this as a bad class.
I am looking at 2016 right now just because you brought it up. Holy hell, what a horrific wide receiver class.
Well, this entire class reminds me of 2016 because you had Zeke, the bell cow RB1, and then Derrick Henry the next round, another hyper elite runner with pass catching question marks. That's Breece Hall and Kenneth Walker. And then there was a bunch of non-starters after that, maybe Jordan Howard.
Wow.
And that's how I'm viewing the running backs as well. Sort of, I like some upside guys. The quarterback class.
One tight end went in the first 2 rounds.
Yeah. Hunter Henry.
Yeah. And oh my goodness. By the way, the 2016 here, there were 4 wide receivers taken in the first round. Corey Coleman, Will Fuller, Josh Dotson, and Laquan Treadwell. Laquan Treadwell was the best of those in the NFL this season. If that goes to show you. And then, of course, there were hits. Michael Thomas and Tyler Boyd were second-round picks. Sterling Shepard was a second-round pick. He hasn't been able to stay on the field. But, Scott, you got guys who aren't even in the league. Braxton Miller, Leonte Carew, Chris Moore.
Yeah, now look at quarterbacks real quick. After Goff and Wentz, it was Paxton Lynch, Christian Hackenberg as QB3, QB4. And so everyone's saying there's going to be a ton of round one wide receivers, in part due to all these holdouts, all these wide receivers demanding massive money, which started with Christian Kirk, oddly enough. There's going to be a ton of quarterbacks in the first round, but everyone hates these quarterbacks. Like, what? And so, yeah, we might be living in 2016 2.0 this season.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, let's not go over the board. I would be hard pressed to think that this class is going to be as abysmal as that one.
Yeah, I don't think so.
There were 31 wide receivers drafted in that, and I'm counting like 5 guys who have had any sort of impact in the NFL out of that, which is insane. And Tyreek Hill was the best of them, and we know why he fell.
Yeah.
Right. So, all right. So let's get into your model. Again, this is merely production. Now, this isn't open source. Forgive me if I'm wrong. You're not like saying, hey, here's all the ingredients to my model. But can you give kind of like a big picture view of it? Like why you think it's a good and accurate model? And what are some of the things that it's really good at? But also, what are some of the things that you think it can't account for?
Yeah, so I think I have the best model in the industry by far. I'm just like so madly in love with my model. I think it's really incredible. You could look at my hit rate last year. The hit rate was great. And my model is even better this year. Something I've struggled with in the past is, so let's say a wide receiver didn't lead his team in receiving yards in his final season, and it was an underclassman. My model would penalize that wide receiver. And so 2 of my biggest misses, let's say Amon-Ra St. Brown, who Wes Huber was madly in love with, or Justin Jefferson even. I think I had him just a little too low. It didn't account for the fact that the underclassmen who led the team in receiving yards above them were hyper elite prospects in Jamar Chase, Drake London. So I finally incorporated something I call a teammate score, which factors in the quality of quarterback play as well as the target competition. And so Wes Huber's Devy rankings was a super valuable resource in this regard. He ranks all the way to like wide receiver 194 in his Devy ranking. So that helped me put an objective number on something fairly subjective. And so my model's a lot better in that regard. I don't want to give away too much for free. I just like worry about people stealing things or copying my process. But I will say I drop hints in the article. For wide receiver, what is massively important, far more than for running backs or tight ends, is age-adjusted production. Breakout age is a common metric. I do age-adjusted stuff. And really, that's just like intuitively, you can make sense of that. It's a positive indicator of talent because, this guy comes in at 18 years old, his body's not fully developed, and he's torching, 21-year-old cornerbacks. It's the same thing as if, you asked an NFL wide receiver to play with one hand tied behind his back and he still put up numbers, that's a positive indicator of talent. So that factors into it. I don't want to give away too much else for free, but we'll probably drop some hints along the way.
Yeah. So let's get into some of the individual prospects. And, this is where I'm really going to get into when you start to incorporate, because you do listen to all kinds of things. So you are going to put out a list of rankings. The model says one thing, but then your rankings say something else. And we're going to start with Drake London, who is, like, since 2000, the 19th best prospect via your model. He's somebody who has been extreme, and I think we're going to get to this with a couple other prospects here, who he's very polarizing. There are certainly, heck, you're one of the reasons, like, there was a big debate about Drake London because of the contested catch thing, and we'll let you talk about that, but I've also discussed Drake London with Greg Cosell, and he's probably lower on Drake London than most of the big name draft analysts. He's probably one of the lowest on him, specifically for that reason. Like, he thinks the whole contested catch thing is a concern, and it was a concern on film, but the production model loves Drake London.
Yeah, so he's really polarizing. Basically, every wide receiver in this class is polarizing, except for Garrett Wilson, who's my wide receiver 4, doesn't really have any serious red flags. Is that enough for him to jump all the way to wide receiver 1? I don't know. I do this model because I like taking the subjective out of it, having objective numbers in front of me. The problem is it's still so insanely subjective. It's like, how damning is his red flag? How damning is Treylon Burks' red flag? Chris Olave's? They all have massive red flags. So at the end of the day, when I do my rankings, there's still going to be a bunch of subjective factors that factor into this. And I'll talk to my 6 go-to film experts, all name brand guys, people I worked with at PFF, Mike Renner, Greg Cosell, Lance Zierlein, Dane Brugler, Danny Kelly, and you pick out one prospect and they're all over the map. Drake London getting legitimate Hakeem Butler comps, not like worst case scenario, but like 1v1, he's Hakeem Butler. Or you get, Mike Renner, he's the hands down best wide receiver in the class. It's the same thing with Treylon Burks. You have Danny Kelly comp him to Deebo Samuel, Lance Zierlein, AJ Brown with more wiggle, Greg Cosell comped him to both. And then you have Jim Nagy saying he's a lesser version of Laviska Shenault. And so really it's just like so much eye of the beholder stuff and a lot of subjectivity in terms of looking at the red flags. We'll talk about London's red flag in a second, but what is there to like? This guy was the number 36 wide receiver recruit in the country coming out of high school, and also the number 30 shooting guard coming out of high school. As an 18.1-year-old true freshman, he competed against Michael Pittman, nearly 4 years older, Amon-Ra St. Brown, nearly 2 years older. At the tail end of the season, final 6 games, he was basically identical to Amon-Ra St. Brown in terms of production. The next season, he was more productive than Amon-Ra St. Brown, despite a significant lack of targets in comparison. And I mean, the guy wasn't even committed to football at this point. He didn't focus solely on football until 2021. He played a couple of games with the USC basketball team. So you really like his numbers adjusted for target competition, adjusted for age, especially his age in comparison to St. Brown's, who, by the way, over the last 6 weeks of his final rookie season last year, only Cooper Kupp scored more fantasy points. So, and Michael Pittman's a top, he's going in the first 3 rounds of dynasty startup. So, that's really impressive. And then his final season was one of the most impressive seasons by any wide receiver ever. He averaged the 10th most yards per game, the 2nd most receptions per game by any Power 5 wide receiver since at least 2002. If you age adjust that, his season ranks top 3. And shockingly elusive after the catch, given his size, by career missed tackles forced per reception. He ranks top 5. Then on the top 12 list, you have guys like DJ Moore, Deebo Samuel, Rondale Moore, Laviska Shenault, all ranking in the top 12. But behind him, he's second youngest wide receiver in this class. Not too many red flags, except for the contested catch thing, which we can get to in a second. But yeah, production model loves him. And just looking at this, like he should be the wide receiver 1.
And the contested catch thing is, and I think one of the names that really jumps out to me about the whole contested catch thing is Josh Dotson. And he was one of those guys, and not to say London is the same kind of prospect, but he was one of those guys I remember like just watching him. Oh my God, look at this catch he made. And then he got to the NFL. He couldn't stay on the field, which doesn't help. And he couldn't separate. And there are very few guys who can win consistently in the NFL without being able to separate. Now, I think that when you look at Drake London, and I think contested catches are objectively a good thing. You want a receiver who can make them. You want a receiver who can body somebody like DeAndre Hopkins. But it's so polarizing. And you mentioned the contested catch thing. I don't think all contested catches are created equal, and I don't think everybody's going to look at them the exact same way when it comes to to Drake London, but you were the guy who raised the tweet, and he's next to names such as, and the funny part was these guys are all built different. There's the bigger guys like Arcega-Whiteside who are on the list of contested catches. There's a smaller guy like Jalen Reagor who's on this list. And none of these guys who are high up on the contested catch rate in college turned out to be anything close to a decent NFL receiver. And it is concerning.
Yeah. So that's the thing is, you could look at his contested catch numbers. He caught 68% of his contested targets in 2021. That's the best ever mark. That's incredible. You could be like, oh, this guy, he turns 50-50 balls into 70-30 balls. What a cheat code. The problem is an extremely high percentage of his targets came on screens, which is a proxy for manufactured touches. And then by percentage of total catches, 31% came on contested targets, which is a massive red flag, which puts him on a list with, like you said, only N'Keal Harry, J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, Jalen Reagor, Denzel Mims. He was fourth on that list.
Arcega-Whiteside's converting to tight end, by the way. So
I saw that, and there's top name film experts who are saying Drake London is more of a tight end, should be a tight end and not a wide receiver. If anything, maybe just a big slot wide receiver. And then if you had a larger sample for that, you would add Josh Dotson, you would add Laquan Treadwell, and you look at the top 30 names and it's all busts, but the bottom 30 is like some of the best players in fantasy. And so this stat to me looks shockingly predictive. And so it's he didn't help himself at his pro day. He was apparently only 95% healthy coming off of injury, but he didn't run the 40-yard dash. So, and that's the knock on him. He's too slow. He can't separate. So the only thing I'll say to counter this is Brett Whitefield, a former PFF guy, have a lot of respect for him, really, really sharp guy. He said, yeah, okay, Jalen Reagor, J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, N'Keal Harry, those guys were totally contested catch guys. But I watched every single target from Drake London, and I only counted 9 true contested catches, which is dramatically different to what PFF had recorded. And you see it on tape too. You see like, okay, he's not Jameson Williams who has 8 yards of separation. He has a cornerback who's always within touching distance of him, but he does seem open where he can position his body and maneuver in a certain way to give himself only the sideline with the cornerback behind him and 5 yards of space. And I'm sort of sympathetic to that. I really loved his tape. I'm not a tape guy. I really like the tape. And I don't know how damning this is just because like his production profile is so much better than Harry's, Whiteside's, Reagor's, Mims. And then there's an argument to be made that, okay, a ton of his production came on screens, but like none of those other contested catch guys got screens. So maybe he's more of an athlete, more of a after the catch guy than a lot of those names. And a different archetype, therefore. And
I want to always, because we have to live in a hot take world. That's what gets clicks. That's what gets the retweets. Cosell, who he would fully admit he's as low as anybody on him, but he would never write a guy off. And he said, could he be a big slot the way Marcus Colston was for New Orleans? Now, Marcus Colston was a 7th round pick, but Marcus Colston also caught 700 passes in the NFL. So, and I think New Orleans uses Michael Thomas, who was a 2nd round pick, also had some questions about his ability to separate in a similar way to how they used Marcus Colston. So maybe is there a way both sides of this end up being right? Where somebody drafts Drake London and they're like, dude, you're a slot receiver. And he catches 75 balls a year. Like, is that like...
Yeah, maybe Dallas takes him and then they trade for Sean Payton next year and he's Michael Thomas 2.0. That'd be awesome. No, I definitely don't like disagreeing with Greg Cosell and especially some of the strongly worded things. He
was pretty low on Thomas, and Thomas was a 2nd round pick. So it wasn't like Thomas was viewed as like this, oh my God, prospect. So I think London's going to be fascinating, and this is merely a hypothetical, Scott. If he doesn't do it in the NFL, that contested catch thing, which is already a massive red flag. That might become like the dinosaur asteroid, just like,
yeah. And I think the NFL is moving in that direction anyway, towards speedier, slighter, low BMI wide receivers who do gain like just 6 yards of separation.
Yeah, and there's going to be guys like that in this class. And let's get to your number 2, which is Jameson Williams out of Alabama. One of the words that Cosell used for Williams, which he didn't use for many receivers in this class, was game changer, potential game changer. Obviously, he's small. He's coming off the injury. Your production model has him second overall, but he didn't produce until he transferred from Ohio State to Alabama.
Yeah, I was really surprised he ranked this highly, despite being something of a true one-year wonder. But that's a testament to his incredible 2021 season. But let's talk. You could look up the article. You could see those numbers, and you could see why his 2021 was so incredible. But let's talk about the red flags, because I don't think people are doing a good enough job addressing the legitimate concerns with Williams. And it's not that he's coming off of an ACL surgery. It doesn't really mean anything to me. For one thing, he had a 22.98 BMI, which is worse than Devonta Smith's. I mean, we spent all offseason nitpicking Smith and his low BMI, and this is legitimately worse than that. You could say, okay, he's coming off of an ACL. He couldn't train, and so maybe that's factored into it. But like, look at the hit rate on sub 25 BMI wide receivers, and he's sub 23 BMI. It's really just Deshaun Jackson, Antonio Bryant, and that's the end of the list.
Antonio Bryant, by the way, had a Merton Hanks neck. His neck was so freaking long, man. The guy looked like a Diplodocus out there. Anyway.
Well, my model likes that because, Davis Mills and no, I'm just kidding. Not something that factors in. And so that's one red flag. I think the bigger, even more damning one is there's a narrative going around that he was buried on the depth chart behind Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson. And that's just not true. He was on the field and he didn't do anything. He had 573 fewer receiving yards than Olave on just 40 fewer routes. So 21% of his production on 82% of his routes run. He ranked 12th worst of 165 qualifying Power 5 wide receivers in yards per route run. So that's bad. That's like really bad. Like if you have Jameson Williams ranked above Chris Olave, which basically everyone does, what is your answer for this? What is your response for that? And I'm not seeing anyone address it. And I'm not even seeing the question being raised, because this to me is a big red flag. For some reason, 2021 was impressive enough that it, vaulted him up to wide receiver 2 in my model, but it's still, you need an answer for that. The only thing I'll say is I went back to the tape and I came away even more impressed. He was always open. Always open. And he just never saw a target. And it was so weird to me. It was almost like, did Justin Fields just hate him? Did he I don't know. Like it was weird. It made me come away less impressed with Fields and more impressed with Williams.
Well, the way I would point it out is he had no targets, but Nick Saban still wanted him. I mean, so Nick Saban saw something on those non-targets. So yeah, and then it is. I think it might just go down to being just one of those weird things. But it is a red flag. I mean, of the red flags that he has beyond the injury, that's probably the one, right? Because I don't think anybody watches Williams or looks at his production profile at Alabama and is like, yeah, this isn't a first-round pick. Because I think everybody who does that comes away with he's one of the 2 or 3 best receivers in this class. But that is a little strange to me.
Right.
Yeah. So we're going to get now to Chris Olave from Ohio State, who I think a lot of people view as a strong route runner. Those who might be a little lower on Olave, and I'm not saying like guys who think he's undraftable, but maybe you have more of a second round grade on him. I think Scott, despite his production, think he's maybe tapped out as kind of a good number 2 in an offense. And the question becomes, is that a first round pick? And I think that's the question with Chris Olave.
Right. I will just say he was basically tied with Garrett Wilson in my model and has a far more damning red flag than Wilson. So I'd bet in my final rankings, Wilson leapfrogs him. But I mean, he broke out as a sophomore. Really impressive production. The next season, he was more efficient, more productive than Garrett Wilson. And then last year, he fell down to wide receiver 3 on the team. I mean, Jackson Smith and Jigba's a Jamar Chase level prospect, so can't really penalize him too much. Production, efficiency, really impressive. The red flag, I mean, you know what it is. He sort of plays like a wussy, and it's just he forced one missed tackle.
I mean, that's
all of last year. Yeah, Sky Moore, David Bell, Wan'Dale Robinson, Drake London, John Mechie, they all had at least 20. He had 1. And if you look at his career missed tackles forced per reception, he's worse than Zach Ertz over the same time frame. Drake London is better than Deebo Samuel over the same time. You can't compare college to NFL 1v1, of course, I get that, but this is just like a frame of reference. And it wasn't just that. It was by career yards after contact per reception, he was worse in the class. By career yards after the catch per reception, he was second worst. And that one's factored into my model. And it's especially concerning because, you could look at his numbers like first downs and touchdowns per target, some of the best seasons of all time. I think he had 2 seasons ranking top 3, but the yards after the catch, there's no real excuse for that. And again, that's factored into my model, but he still, ranked pretty highly, wide receiver 3. So it's just, how much do you want to weight that? I mean,
yeah. And for him, even though, I mean, he ran a 4.39. So I think if you look at Chris Olave and you're like, oh my God, 4.39, great. You actually think he's kind of, just for his size, just kind of an average athlete.
Right. I will say, I thought he tested better than Garrett Wilson, who has a sub 25 BMI, which is another red flag.
Interesting. When it comes to Olave, let's talk Wilson. And the comparison, I think Cosell's made this comp. I think Brett Whitefield, who you mentioned, formerly at PFF, has made the comp as well. Stephon Diggs, undersized, didn't test great, just knows how to play the position.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I need to spend more time watching the tape, but I don't know. That just feels lofty to me, just based on his production and athleticism metrics. But again, his numbers were really impressive. Like I said, Olave was more productive in 2020, but it was they both had 2 of the best seasons of any wide receiver. They both ranked top 4 in yards per team pass attempt. They both ranked top 10 in yardage market share. It's like so obscene to see 2 wide receivers on the same team ranked top 10 in yardage market share. And it was tough target competition. They were up against Jameson Williams, who's another projected round 1 wide receiver. Great metrics by yards per route run. Didn't have the ideal breakout age. And the red flag with him is he never led his team in receiving yards or receiving yards per game. And again, I think that's why the big change in my model this year, incorporating team score, did him some favors, because again, Jackson Smith and Jigba, I think, is a Jamar Chase level prospect. And I don't say that lightly, because Jamar Chase was the only perfect wide receiver prospect I've ever come across. And love that guy.
Yeah. And I mean, he was one of those guys who everybody struggled to come up with weaknesses for him. And last year, obviously, and I don't think anybody would even argue there's a Waddle or a Devontae Smith in this class.
No.
So maybe somebody might like a bigger guy more than Devontae Smith, but I mean, yeah, right. I'm not going to.
There might not be
for who his teammates are.
There might not be a Elijah Moore in this class.
Yeah,
my model,
boy.
Loved him.
Oh, speaking of, just so we can talk about your model, just because we want transparency here. Who were some of the guys that your model liked that might have been like day 2 or day 3 picks who turned out to be big hits? Otherwise, who might be some of the guys who it missed on, and what did you do to account for that? Because I know you changed this when you're like, you know what, I should have had that and I didn't.
Yeah. So just to talk about running backs for a second, my model's all-time biggest miss, or my running back model's biggest weakness is it always overrates Mike Leach running backs. So I've had to every year since I discovered that manually adjust Mike Leach running backs downwards. Yeah. And so I see that with some of the receivers in this class, because Sky Moore, I mean, everyone loves Sky Moore, but his numbers were massively inferior to Dwayne Eskridge's 2020. His numbers in his breakout freshman season were inferior to Jaden Reed's, who had significantly worse quarterback play and was competing for targets against Dwayne Eskridge. He played cornerback 1 year with Sky Moore. The tight end, Greg Dulcich, one of my biggest misses was Caleb Wilson, the other UCLA tight end. So I look at some things like that. Another player is Tyler Johnson. My production model's all-time biggest miss. Yeah. But luckily, everyone in the NFL was saying there's massive athleticism concerns, and then he opted out of every event at the combine. So I chose to manually adjust him heavily downwards. And so I wonder, I mean, hey, do I do the same thing with David Bell, who tests as a bottom 5 percentile athlete? Do I do the same thing with Drake London, who opted out of every event at his pro day? Yeah. And those are just, subjective decisions I'll have to make, and they're sort of tricky.
But this is why draft capital is important, because I talked to Cosell about David Bell, and he's like Cosell said he recalled like audible gasps at the combine in 2002 when Anquan Bolden ran the 40, because he ran at 4.7. And, and he talked about Bell as like, he compared him to Van Jefferson, who also didn't test great. I threw Tyler Boyd out there, who also didn't test great. I think draft capital is what's going to be so important with these guys, though, because some guys who have not been great athletes in the past, like Jarvis Landry, Tyler Boyd, Van Jefferson, Cooper Kupp, these guys were day 2 picks. Tyler Johnson, it's like almost like they view that as far worse. Sorry, my dog is like hacking up back here. But they viewed him as far worse because he was a day 3 pick. He was a 5th rounder. I think that was just one of those guys who it seemed draft Twitter and the draft Knicks were so much higher on than the actual teams making picks. So that's why draft capital is so important in your post-draft model.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like to, like, I want to beat the NFL draft. I want to beat the NFL team. So like, I really like having my pre-draft rankings super on point. I will say Bob McGinn, who does excellent work asking a bunch of NFL personnel various questions about the prospects anonymously. One NFL team said they moved David Bell down 3 rounds following his combine. And I think that's warranted. It was just really one of the worst combines ever. I said this basically means he should play slot only in the NFL, because athleticism matters far less at the wide receiver position than the running back or especially tight end position. But it matters especially less at the slot wide receiver position. Cooper Kupp, Keenan Allen, Jarvis Landry, Hunter Renfrow, a bunch of slot wide receivers who ranked similarly low in my by sports score. I will say I talked to a PFF buddy of mine yesterday who said David Bell is a Keenan Allen clone, which, I mean, that's, I guess, the upside argument for him. Another predominant slot who was unathletic but is super crispy in route running. So, again, a lot of these guys are polarizing.
Allen also had an injury, I think, because I remember a lot of draft Knicks when Keenan Allen came out, we're talking about him as a first-round pick, and then he went in the 3rd. That injury was also a factor with him. Now, this is interesting to me because your Spork, which is basically it doesn't actually stand for anything, Spork. It's not a typo. He doesn't mean spark. It's just what you call it. I think we called it a combination of 2 useful things, like a spoon and a fork. But it's your own athleticism model. And now this is what's interesting to me, because people were like holding their nose at Treylon Burks's combine, but your Spork score actually kind of likes him relative to guys like Olave and Garrett Wilson in this class. He's your number 5 receiver, another polarizing guy who you mentioned there's comps to AJ Brown out there. There's comps to Chenault. Okay, so
yeah,
both of whom were second round picks, by the way.
Yeah, so I'll just say there's a lot of like athleticism measurements, like scores going around. One way in which mine is different is like everything is basically weight adjusted, or weight adjustments play a heavy role in coming up with a score. And so this was the fastest wide receiver class ever, but it's also the skinniest. And so if you adjust for that, it's just like a perfectly average class by speed score, weight adjusted 40 time. So I had Burks as a 66 percentile athlete, so he's above average, but it was definitely underwhelming compared to what people were expecting, which was low 4.4s in the 40 and things of that nature. But yeah, let's talk Treylon Burks. This was a player, just looking at the box scores, I thought would be the clear unanimous wide receiver one. I mean, age adjusted yardage market share off the charts, age adjusted yards per route run off the charts. And it was hard to find any super damning red flags. And then, of course, you know, my model isn't just box score stuff. It really digs into the advanced analytics and the predictive ones. And so, again, numbers look absolutely insane, but you dig deeper. For one thing, he had the lowest teammate score of any wide receiver in my top 7, but I talk about that and why I don't think that's super relevant. I think he did enough despite that to overcome any concerns there. But here's where things get risky. Here's where Treylon Burks starts waving around red flags like a fat girl in color guard. Burks was never asked to do anything typically demanded of NFL wide receivers. Sure, that's true of any wide receiver in this class. They don't face press coverage as often as an NFL wide receiver. Okay, but it goes so far beyond that with Burks. He was seemingly never tasked with the responsibility of having to beat an actual cornerback in coverage. The only exception is the go route. Instead, Arkansas consistently went out of their way to manufacture touches for him, get the ball in his hands. So screens are a proxy for manufactured touches. Go routes are far more a college football route than an NFL route. Makes up 22% of all wide receiver yardage in college, only 14% in the NFL. So besides those two routes, he's really shown us not much of anything. 56% of his receiving yards came on screens and go routes. That was by far the most of any wide receiver in the class. Laviska Shenault in 2018, 44%. Jameson Williams, the best deep threat in the country, only 17%. And so without that, his yards per game average drops from 92 to 40.3. Yards per target takes a massive dive as well. And then last season, he only had 17 non-screen catches against man coverage when lined up as a wide receiver. Among the top 15 wide receivers in this class, only one wide receiver ranked below him. It was George Pickens, who had 5 catches the entire year. Yeah. Drake London had twice as many, and that was identical to Laviska Shenault's 2018. All of this massively concerning. People talk about him as a yak monster. Okay, you know, the numbers really bear that out. But again, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Again, it seems fraudulent. And indeed, Treylon Burks' production profile looks incredible on first glance, but it's also the most fraudulent production profile as Laviska Shenault's. It's identical to Laviska Shenault's. 32% of his total yards after the catch came on just 3 plays. Without that, he falls from best in the class, Jameson Williams, to 11th, tied with John Mechie. And add it all up, it's like massively concerning. The only thing I'll say is like he had by far the smallest sample lined up outside against man coverage, the smallest sample against press coverage, the smallest sample against whatever, but he also ranked best, you know, like on that small sample. So there's arguments you can make for him. The most concerning thing about all this is it's not really factored into my model. These are just like too advanced. And so I'm probably going to have to push him down because this does sort of scare the crap out of me, makes him risky, makes him landing spot dependent. He's probably going to be slow to develop in the NFL. So he's my wide receiver 5. I'll probably have to push him to wide receiver 6 behind George Pickens, but we'll see. I need to spend a day thinking about this.
Yeah, well, let's talk Pickens because I know I talked to Cosell last week and he said George Pickens is his favorite receiver in the entire draft.
Yeah.
I think obviously he had some injuries. There were some Georgia fans. I don't know. He had a couple incidents in college. Georgia fans saying he needs to grow up. I'm always kind of a little leery of that because
according to a scout via Bob McGinn, there's at least one NFL team that hasn't taken fully off their board due to off the field concerns.
Yeah. So I mean, we're talking just full tape production model when it comes to George Pickens.
Right. Exactly. So again, age adjusted production, really impressive. 18.5-year-old true freshman. Dominated, led the team in receiving by a margin. He smashed in the Sugar Bowl. The next year, a slight uptick in yards per game average. Again, ended the year on a high note, dominated at the Peach Bowl. And then 2021, you have to throw that all out. He suffered an ACL. He came back well before the typical timeline. He's a tough, gritty player. You see that by all the fights he gets in with cornerbacks on the sideline. It was a miracle he returned it all, and he got 5 catches, 107 yards, and 32 routes run. But basically, you just got to take that out, and that's what I did. I threw that season out, treated him as if he was coming out after 2020, and he ranked 6th. There are some concerns with him. Again, I hate disagreeing with Greg Cosell, but I definitely don't see him as the top wide receiver in this class. Some red flags include 67% of his targets came on just 2 routes, the hitch and the go. Interestingly, that was the exact same as DK Metcalf. And we all know how that turned out. Despite the SEC pedigree, really underwhelming target competition throughout his Georgia career, but technically NFL caliber quarterback play from Jake Fromm, technically, very technically. And then his numbers were only good. They weren't great. He was worst in the class by yards after the catch per reception. He was best in the class by drop rate, but that's not really a predictable variable at all. Certainly not on par with yards after the catch per reception. And then the athleticism I thought was very underwhelming. Good size, good height, but underwhelming.
Yeah. Well, the thing with Pickens, by the way, I don't want to knock a guy by saying what like concerns about his character, like the guys out there committing crimes. He's basically gotten into fights on the football field. And
I mean, I love that. I want to boost some of my model for that.
But teams are going to look into that. And Cosell actually brought this point up too. He said, maybe that's a competitiveness thing, but you said you have to think the guy's competitive because he worked to rehab to get back from the ACL to play down the stretch in a national championship run. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know anything about George Pickens. The kid, I do know he had some on-field incidents that pissed Georgia fans off. Okay, he had to apologize to his team for that, but he did work his way back. So that's just very interesting. But you said Bob McGinn's article, who does this every year.
Yeah, I'd guess it extends beyond that, just because according to this quote, at least one NFL team has him totally off their board. I mean, this is a high-level talent to just totally write him off because, I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's just a dummy team. What's really cool, though, like you really see this on tape with George Pickens. Thor Nystrom had a great tweet thread showing like all the physicality and fights with cornerbacks. There are some plays where like dust-ups with cornerbacks where this were Chris Olave. He would have called the cops and ran off crying. But really impressive stuff.
The thing is like I always gave compliments to I used to say Steve Smith is the king of this. Steve Smith played like a freaking asshole. Like, I mean, like, and I mainly mean that as a compliment, but there is a thin line. You let somebody get in your, I mean, when Odell Beckham was young, Josh Norman literally got him ejected from a game. Like, Josh Norman knew he could
get it in his head. He shut him down too.
Yeah. Like he knew he could get him. Like Josh Norman, Scott, his plan was coming into that game, I'm going to get Odell Beckham thrown out of this game, and he did. Like literally, that was his plan. So
smart, yeah.
There is like a competitiveness balance that has to be struck with that. Jahan Dotson out of Penn State, somebody who's near and dear to my heart. Get this young man a quarterback, please.
Yeah, exactly. So that was the big thing. Is if you look at his production, of course, it doesn't really stack up against like the Chris Olaves of the world, but you do have to adjust for quarterback play. If you look at PFF's numbers, he had a near identical separation rate to Olave, on a near identical average depth of target, which indicates like difficulty of throw. And yet they both ranked top 7 in separation rate. Olave led all wide receivers in accurate pass percentage on open targets. Dotson ranked bottom 5. It was a significant disadvantage. Yet by yards per target, they were exactly the same. So that's really in his favor. Pretty good production despite, some NFL quality target competition in KJ Hamler, Pat Freiermuth. I will say he struggled against man coverage. He is not a good athlete per my numbers. He is very red flag, low BMI. So I think he's going to have to play slot in the NFL, but maybe he could be a great one.
Yeah. Comp was, this is Cosell, Deontay Johnson with better hands.
That was Danny Kelly's
Johnson
comp.
Was not a good athlete at the combine.
That was Danny Kelly's comp. So I like that. Me, I love Deontay Johnson.
Yeah. And sometimes it's just like, I think the brains sometimes at wide receiver are just like, it's so important just knowing how to get open. And I think that's what's going to come into play with David Bell. We also have some guys like Wan'Dale Robinson from Kentucky, who kind of maybe fits the modern NFL here a little bit. He's your number 8 receiver. We'll talk about him maybe quickly because I do want to get to how you deal with non-Power 5 receivers, because there's going to be plenty of those guys drafted as well.
Yeah, I mean, Wan'Dale is like one of my pet loves of this class. Red flag is obviously the short stature. He's 5'8". That was like one of the worst news of the combine. Kentucky had him listed at 5'11". Since 1990, there's only one wide receiver 5'8" or shorter with multiple seasons with at least 650 receiving yards, which is not a lot of receiving yards. And that was Cole Beasley. And that wasn't his only red flag. He basically identical to Treylon Burks and a lot of manufactured touches, everything coming in the slot, which is less predictive production than outside production, because you have all the space to work. You're up against linebackers who are slow and you don't have like really good sticky nickel cornerbacks like you do in the NFL. So it's just less meaningful, less predictive. And he also had like no target competition and arguably one of maybe a top 3 quarterback in next year's class, Will Levis.
Which is mind-blowing to me because Levis was terrible at Penn State. Like, horrible.
No, I know. I like him. I just, he makes those like 5 super wow throws, and the NFL just is always going to overdraft that. But
yeah, I mean, but Penn State's quarterback stunk too. And I just like, but by the way, Penn State opens like, I think on a Thursday night at Purdue, a perfect opportunity for Sean Clifford to shit his pants on national television and the freshman quarterback to come in. So, but anyway, that's enough ranting.
Yeah. So he gets like mini Debo comps, and you really see that he was the number 1 all-purpose running back coming out of high school. Split his time 50-50 running back, wide receiver in his freshman season. He was great in both areas. And then later on a full-time slot, and the numbers are off the charts. They're off the chains. His 2021, if age adjusted, is maybe the best in the class. So really like him as an upside play, but yeah, massive concerns like Treylon Burks, and then the height, which is the minuscule catch radius. Would love to see him in Green Bay. That would be ideal with like an accurate quarterback. So the catch radius isn't a big deal, but yeah, a guy I'm rooting for.
So you don't match up your Power 5 wide receivers with the non-Power 5 wide receivers. I think the answer is going to be obvious, but why do you do that? And how do you then put your non-Power 5 wide receivers into the bigger picture? Because you have to eventually. So why do you separate them out at first? And then how do you put them back into the full picture?
Yeah, so I'll just say real quick, Wan'Dale was my wide receiver 8 by production model. He'll fall due to the height and some other red flags. John Mechie was wide receiver 9, and his numbers look even better if you injury adjust, which you should. So he's going to jump a ways. But then I think after Mechie is where I bring in the non-power 5 wide receivers. And why I do that is my model has a significant blind spot for non-power 5 wide receivers, just because, I mean, the bust rate is horrible. If you look at the top non-power 5 wide receivers of the past whatever years, you get all these like Daniel Breverman types and like Brenneman, I don't even know, but just like a bunch of like massive busts who smashed. Thank you. And so my model has a blind spot again, so I had to break them up into 2 tiers to make my model more accurate. And guess what? My model has a bias against non-power 5 wide receivers, but so do I. I just do. And you know what? I kind of don't like these non-power 5 wide receivers as much as NFL teams do. Sky Moore is a fringe round 1 wide receiver. I like him. He's going to be behind John Mechie, but I certainly don't like him that much. Christian Watson, massive upside. Really love the upside there, but he's risky. Like all these wide receivers are risky. Jalen Tolbert, Alec Pierce. Again, hate to disagree with Greg Cosell, but I had Alec Pierce well behind Christian Watson and Sky Moore, and basically tied with Jalen Tolbert.
I will have you know that the top 2 fantasy point scorers at the wide receiver position were non-power 5 wide receivers.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I mentioned in my article, like the bust rate's horrible, but randomly the 2 best ever wide receivers were Jerry Rice and Cooper Kupp. So, I mean, yeah.
Devontae Adams went to Fresno State. So
there you go.
Yeah. Christian Watson, I actually mocked him in the first round of our little staff mock for our prospect guide. I mocked him to Kansas City. Just because I think somebody's going to take a bet on the athleticism, but he's a challenging evaluation because the separation he gets at North Dakota State is not even close to what he's going to get in the NFL, because, I mean, he's playing against guys who look like they're sophomores in high school.
Right. He, to me, on tape reminded me of like if Randy Moss were mortal, but like the way he glides and that speed is just so rare. And I really think that, plus one of the best combines in NFL history, top 20 of any wide receiver since 2000. Some team is going to take a chance on him and hope they could develop him. But yeah, certainly red flags. He had great quarterback play, Trey Lance, Easton Stick, but he never truly dominated against minimal target competition. Again, an FCS wide receiver. He had a undiverse route tree, worst hands in the class. He did nothing on contested catches, like worst contested catch receiver despite his massive size. And so, yeah, I mean, he's risky, but one of the best yards per route run seasons of all time in 2021. Lot of upside there.
One more guy we have to talk about before we go, unfortunately, and I know what the film take is, and asking a friend of mine who has seen, I asked him about Justin Ross, and he just texted me a frowny face. Like, not the same since the injuries. Now, it's tough to evaluate Ross after the neck injury and the other injuries because his quarterback play was so atrocious at Clemson. This past year, Uiagalelei was terrible, but Justin Ross, his 2019 popped. Unfortunately, since then, he might not hear his name called until day 3 of the draft.
Right, he might not get drafted at all. This is like a really severe injury. Multiple neurosurgeons and doctors told him to never play football again. NFL teams maybe are not going to take that risk. A lot of them don't think he can ever be the same player again. The pro day, apparently he wasn't at all healthy for the pro day, was highly alarming. And I think you really have to throw out the 2021 season because not only was he playing with bottom 5 quarterback play, but it was also he didn't practice at all in the offseason. The day he was supposed to return, he developed COVID. He lost 15 pounds. So it set him back another 2 weeks. You're 2 weeks from the start of the season. And on the second play of the first scrimmage, he breaks a bone in his foot. And then he had to play with this orthotic placement that severely limited his route running and straight line ability. And he played with that all season. And so you really just have to throw it out. And what are you left with? You're left with yeah, this guy might not get drafted. NFL teams might want to not take the risk. They might not think he'll ever get back to being the same player, the liability risk. But what are you left with? You're left with the greatest age-adjusted, target competition adjusted freshman season of all time. And from 2019 to 2020, competing against T. Higgins, Hunter Renfrow, Amari Rodgers, he was basically 100% of T. Higgins on 100% of on a route per route basis, 88.5% of his receiving yards and 86.8 as many routes run. And it's like, well, what's the price on Justin Ross going to be in dynasty rookie drafts? He's going to fall to round 7 or go UDFA and then he's free. But that maybe you're getting 100, maybe there's a 30% chance he's 100% of T. Higgins. So I'm always going to gravitate towards that sort of upside.
Scott, it's been an illuminating conversation. I wanted to talk wide receivers since it was fresh in our minds. We're going to talk running backs and tight ends next week, tight end classes. There's some interesting players, but I don't think anybody would consider it a great class. Running backs, interesting, maybe not so much in terms of bell cows, but there's some interesting guys here. But we'll talk that next week as we head into the NFL draft. I want to remind everybody to check out the prospect guide at fantasypoints.com, which has Greg Cosell's evaluations. It's got Wes Huber's Devy profiles. It's got our mock draft. Scott, your model, your articles are all up available for a subscription on the website. I mean, Wes Huber's Devy profiles are available on the website. I don't know why dynasty players would have to go anywhere else. Of course, I'm biased. I am wearing a Fantasy Points hat, see, which you can buy at the Fantasy Points store. But it was great talking to you, Scott. I hope everybody's got a great weekend planned. We're going to be talking a lot next week because it's NFL draft time. Good talking to you, Scott. Good talking to everybody who was in the chat. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks to Kukanis behind the glass. See y'all.